Thanks a lot for having me. I appreciate being here. I am a reporter with the Lawrence Journal-World. I've been reporting news in Lawrence and Douglas County now for 23 years. I'm on my 23rd year. Been with the Journal-World since 2001. Before that, I worked for a weekly newspaper company and then ended up owning it for a while. That was down in Baldwin City. And in 2001, I sold that to the World Company and went to work for the Journal-World. It's been there ever since. So I cover city government is a big part of what I cover. I also cover the business community, and I write a couple of columns for the paper these days. I write the Town Talk column, which appears every weekday on the LJWorld site, and then appears periodically in the actual printed newspaper. And then I write Lawhorn's Lawrence, which is kind of a more feature-oriented column about people and places, the history of the community, and that appears each Sunday. So today I'm just going to, the biggest thing I want to do is open it up to questions at the end, because I find that most of the time what most people want to do is just ask questions about what's going on around town, and I'm happy to talk about that if I know anything about it. And if I don't know anything about it, I'll probably talk about it anyway. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some issues going on at City Hall, but I also was told people wanted to hear a little bit about a book that I was involved with. And so I'll start there. I was an editor for this book called Postmarked, Bleeding Kansas. Long story short, I had an opportunity come to me from a volunteer at the Watkins Museum. She had access to about 150 letters that were written by a pioneer couple by the name of Edward and Sarah Fitch, who lived in Lawrence shortly after the founding of the town, lived in Lawrence through Quantrill's raid. And he wrote letters back to his parents, primarily in Massachusetts, and there were over 150 of them. The Fitch family, over the years, had kept and preserved those letters. Watkins had copies of them. They had printed kind of a homemade book of those letters early, and got it in the book about the early 90s, I believe, is when they did that, and it kind of went out of publication. And, it was around the time of the 150th commemoration anniversary of remembrance of Quantrill's raid, and the volunteer wanted to really see about getting those letters back out again. And so I said, well, I'm happy to read them and see what I think of them. And I read them and realized that they're not only interesting, but they're important, because they do tell an interesting story of the community. So the first thing I want to do is just I tell folks the best thing about this book is I wrote very little of it. I mean, most of it is actually just the letters, word for word. We kept them in the format that they were, so you could see how people spelled and how they wrote and that sort of thing. I did write the foreword, and this is kind of what was on my mind when I wrote this. I'm not a historian, and the title of this book proves it. The phrase "birthplace of the Civil War" would make historians squirm and immediately begin searching for a place to attach a footnote. But since I'm not a historian, I don't squirm, and the most likely thing I'm to do with a foot is to insert it in my own mouth. I'm a storyteller. I've been a professional journalist telling stories in Lawrence and Douglas County, Kansas for more than 2 decades. And when I first read the frontier letters of Edward and Sarah Fitch, I recognized them for what they are, a beginning. The first letter with a Lawrence postmark from Edward Fitch is dated March 4th, 1855. Indeed, that was very near the beginning. The first party of the New England Immigrant Aid Company arrived at the site that is now Lawrence on August 1st, 1854. Edward's first letter was about tending school. He was a teacher at a school/boarding house that tended to about 10 to 15 men and boys. Edward told his parents how he would make breakfast each morning, spend 6 hours in the classroom, wash dishes after supper, haul water 70 rods in the evening, and find time to chop all the wood for the school's needs. Although he didn't ask in his first letter, the writings that soon would follow included multiple requests for his parents to send money. So parents of modern-day students of Kansas University can take comfort in knowing that the cries for cash have been coming from Lawrence since nearly the beginning. Edward, and eventually his wife, Sarah, would write much from Lawrence. Over the next 8 years, the couple would write more than 150 letters to family members, mostly to Edward's parents back in Hopkinton, Massachusetts. Members of the Fitch family in the many decades to follow would save those letters. All who are interested in the beginnings of Lawrence, Kansas owe members of the Fitch family a debt of gratitude. The writings of Edward provide a look at the early life of Lawrence and the relentless routine of frontier living that often does not make it into the history books. That's because Edward Fitch is not the type of man history often shines a spotlight on. He was an ordinary man in many ways. He first was a teacher, later a farmer, and finally an employee at his father-in-law's book and stationery store. But in a sense, that's what makes these letters so interesting. Edward Fitch wrote the type of history many of us would have lived. Well, that is, if we would have made the courageous decision to live in the very unordinary place of Lawrence. There was perhaps no other place in the country quite like Lawrence, Kansas in the mid-1850s. It has been said that while other cities were founded on commerce, Lawrence was founded on conviction. As the letters will attest, there certainly were many men looking to make their fortunes in Lawrence, but it also is true that the conviction that slavery must be abolished permeated the community. It permeated Edward. In some of the letters you will read where Edward criticized both President Lincoln and his wife. While Lincoln was intent on maintaining the union of a country, Edward was intent on breaking the bonds of slavery. Trying to fight a war without touching slavery is like trying to put out a fire without water, Edward wrote to his parents in 1862. Edward knew about fire. You'll see several of Edward's letters back home included instructions for his parents to purchase a Navy Colt revolver and send it to him, along with 1,000 rounds of ammunition. He talked about the time period where he, nor any other sane man, ever left their homes without a Sharps rifle in their hands. And he wrote about death, first excitedly and eventually nonchalantly. From July 23, 1856, nearly a full 5 years before the Battle of Fort Sumter and the traditional history book beginning of the war. We have had rather still times for this latitude. True, some 2 or 3 men have been shot at and killed for going to Topeka to attend the meeting of the Free State Legislature, but such occurrences are so common here that they hardly cause a remark. That paragraph says a lot about the condition of Lawrence and Douglas County in the mid-1850s. The history books may not say war had begun, but Douglas County certainly was suffering from perhaps the cruelest casualty of war, callousness toward death. That's why I say with no hesitation that Edward and Sarah Fitch provided us dispatches from the birthplace of the Civil War. I'll leave it to some other book to argue whether Sumter or Bull Run or Douglas County's Battle of Blackjack was the true first battle of the Civil War. That's not what I mean when I say this area of eastern Kansas and western Missouri was the birthplace of the Civil War. I'll concede this ground may not be where cannons were first precisely placed and men were ordered to march to secure a flank. Rather, this is the place where the idea for a civil war was born. This is where beliefs turn to blood. Before every war, there must first be a line drawn. For the American Civil War, the line was drawn in Kansas. The men with the biggest sticks, who created that line in the sand, lived in Lawrence. Edward Fitch lived among them. His name will not show up in many history books with the likes of Lane or Robinson or Brown. His stick wasn't as big, but he carried something else into battle, a pen. In the end, it may have been just as powerful. It tells an important story of an ordinary family making an extraordinary stand for a belief that would change a country. Along the way, there were the very human stories of failed crops, sick children, false hopes, and lingering doubts. Pieced together, Edward and Sarah's pen tells a story of warriors on a frontier, wondering if their country would follow them. Perhaps the historians never will recognize those times as the beginning of the Civil War. That's all right. Edward and Sarah Fitch did, and that's good enough for me. See for yourself. So, I mean, I've always enjoyed the history of Lawrence since I moved here and have known a little bit about it. And these letters, I think, really help underscore what a lot of us already know, is that some very important history happened in Lawrence. That, you know, for all of Kansas, for that matter, but particularly in Lawrence. I mean, the eyes of the country were squarely planted on this place that we call home now during those time periods. And so these letters, I hope, give folks kind of a very authentic account of what life was like during those time periods. So I'm just going to read a couple of short letters, and then I'll change gears here, and we can certainly ask questions about the book or the letters at the end, and along with other subjects. But this one letter I liked because it kind of gives folks a little bit of an idea about life in Lawrence at that time, both the mundane and the not so mundane. This was written on September 30th of 1855, and it starts, "Dear parents," and this is from William, not Sarah. Most of the letters in the book are from William, a few are from Sarah. "Dear parents, if the adage is true that what we have but little of we praise highly, It must be that letters from home are very valuable with me, for I have but few of them. And if the opposite is true, my letters cannot be very valuable to you. And I guess that I will stop writing and prove the truth of the first proposition by writing so few that you will value them so much that you will be glad to write one for the sake of getting more. So that's quite a paragraph there, but I think he's telling his folks that they ought to write him more. So I've got my house done, and I'm now writing in it. I let the lower part for $1.50 per week and kept the upper part to sleep in myself. I've got all my things here, a chair, table, and bookcase, and I can sit here and write or read at my ease. I've been at work on the hotel for the last week and more. My work has been to boil the tar, or rather the composition, to put on the roof. It is made of gas tar and rosin and some other things. It comes in barrels. I have to open barrels to boil the tar or melt it and haul it up on top of the building. I have boiled 6 barrels. I get myself all covered with the tar stuff. It is dirty, or rather sticky work. The overalls that I have worn will be good for nothing else when I get done. I can have work on the hotel all along for some time, but I don't know about it for today. I hear that my claim will be jumped if I ain't there. He had a piece of property outside of town as well. I was out there one night last week and like to have froze to death. I had to put in a wheat crop this fall, but I have not the capital. I shall have to stay more on my claim, and I can't hardly work here and do it without a horse. And I have no money to get one. What to do, I hardly know. I received a letter from you, Father, on August 28th, which you said was the first you had written, and then I received on the 19th instead, number 3. If you ever wrote number 2, I never got it. You ought to have a paper and set down the number and date of the letters I write. Also the date of these I received and the time when I received them. Tomorrow is the day appointed by the legislature for the election of delegates to Congress. And today we hear there is a large body of armed men within a few miles that say they're going to burn this town and kill all the Yankees, and that they say they will not take more than 10 minutes. The town is in a state of intense excitement. There have been large numbers of cartridges made today. The company have cleaned up all the rifles and put new caps in all of them and are preparing to give the Missourians Jesse if they come here. I hardly think that there will be a fight, but can't certainly tell. You have no idea the state of things that exist here, and you cannot conceive of our feelings. We're going to let them have their election all their own way and not vote at all until Tuesday, the 9th. And then the Free State men have an election called by the sovereign people, so that 2 men will probably go to Congress, Whitfield and Reeder. And Congress must decide which is entitled to seat. Why don't Albert write? That's one of his brothers. Tell him that we shall not send a National Democrat to Congress this fall. It has been very cold here for a few days, so that on the lowlands there has been some frost, but not much. Not so much that we are still haying around here. Yours as ever, Edward P. Fitch. So to summarize, write more letters, Mom, Dad. Been working on the roof of the hotel with tar. Boy, I don't know how I'm going to get this thing figured out with my land. Kind of hint there. Maybe you could send me some money. That might help. And oh, by the way, there's a bunch of men outside the city looking to kill us all. And it's been kind of frosty, but we can still hay. So in my business, that's kind of what we call burying the lead. My advice to you is if ever you're writing a letter that involves a group of men outside of town looking to kill all of you, put that in the first paragraph. Lead with that right there. That's the best way to start that letter. But he didn't. So the last letter I'll read, it happened in December 8th of 1855, and it kind of gives a good indication of how the tone has changed in that time period. This isn't the letter, this is just a little bit about a footnote here about what was going on December 8th, 1855 in that time period. This letter was written near the end of the 2-week siege of Lawrence, which was the chief event of the Wakarusa War. The trouble began on November 22nd when Coleman, the pro-slavery sheriff of Douglas County, arrested Jacob Branson on a peace warrant sworn against him by a friend of Coleman. Near Blanton's Bridge, Sheriff Jones gave up his prisoner when he was confronted by a determined group of Free State men led by S.N. Wood. He then notified Governor Shannon that rebellion had broken out and that he needed 3,000 men to carry out the laws. The governor called out the territorial militia, which had 2 generals but no troops. Besides the 250 Kansas residents sworn into the militia by the 2 generals, his call also was answered by a large group of armed Missouri residents, headed by Senator David Atchison. Most of them camped near Franklin, a few miles to the southeast. Together, with other contingents north of the Kaw and at Lecompton, they cut off all traffic to Lawrence, including the U.S. mail. The resulting threat to the city caused Free State supporters from the surrounding area to gather in its defense. And here's this short letter. Dear parents, The mail arrived last night and brought me a letter from Appleton of 32 pages, but none from you. As the mail is to go back this morning, I must write a few lines, as it may be the last time I shall ever have to write. As you probably know, before this time, we are in a stage of siege. An army lays near our border. The company to which I belong slept under arms last night, not knowing at what moment we might be called upon to repel an attack from the enemy. We don't know what may come. We may possibly I say, escape without a battle. A man from our camp was killed day before yesterday and is to be buried today. Give my love to all my friends, whether I ever see them or not. Pray for us and for me. Our help is in God. I could not write more, as I fear the mail will go. We have a number of forts thrown up, which we mean to defend to the death. My station will be Hunt's Fort. We have one cannon. Yours, Edward. So that letter kind of got to me just because the thought that I kept having after reading that was his poor mother. Just think about that for a second. I mean, this is how people communicated back then. There was no telephone. There was no, I mean, you waited until the mail arrived and you get this letter, and you know, the last thing you know is that your son was sleeping under arms in a camp with one cannon, and that a group of men were outside the city. And you wait for the next letter, or perhaps the paper picks something up a few weeks later and you read about it, but even then you wouldn't know the fate of your son. Just very difficult times, and that letter made me think about him in a different way than I had. So the book is, like I said, full of letters. It's really just letter after letter, and it's neat that we have so many of them that it kind of does tell a story, and you do get a sense of the people's personalities. Edward was he was a character in some ways, a very straight-laced man, not a character in a cut-up or anything, but really worked hard to try to do several things. Was a teacher, and maybe that's probably what he should have remained, but he ended up thinking he was going to be a land speculator and didn't do real well with that. Thought he was going to be a farmer. Didn't do real well with that. Had a piece of property. What's ironic is, you know, he worked so hard to be a land speculator, and you know where his land ended up being at in Lawrence? Right about 31st and Iowa Street. So if he could have just lasted another century or so, he'd have done okay in the land speculation business. But so many things. The letters get more emotional, more dramatic as the time. There's some letters. Some of them you've probably read. Sarah Fitch's letter, perhaps it's been out in the Journal-World and other publications about the day of Quantrill's raid. She wrote a couple of other letters related to Quantrill's raid that aren't as well known that are in here. And so if you're interested in the book, I have some copies, but also available at the Raven, at Watkins, at LMH Gift Shop, at Hastings, Amazon. So it's fairly readily available. But and I'm happy to take questions on it.
When was it published?
When was it published? It was published right. We tried to get it out for the 150th anniversary or commemoration, and we missed it by about a month. It was published in I think technically came out in October of then. So it's been out just about a year now. So, but I was also told people wanted me to talk a little bit about the other side of what I do in terms of writing for the Journal-World, and what I normally do is just try to tell you a few issues that I think are happening down at City Hall, or likely to happen over the next few months. Three of them that I think will probably take up a lot of time and garner a lot of attention. First one is voters in November are going to get to decide whether to pass a new sales tax for a police headquarters building. That's about $28 million that the city's looking to spend for that. 0.2% sales tax that lasts for 9 years, or a little less depending on how much money is raised by the sales tax. And you know, that will be an issue that will be talked a lot about in the next few weeks. There's a citizens group that has formed to support the project. The city will do quite a bit here in the next few weeks to try to get people out to the police headquarters facilities. They're spread out in several different buildings around town. I would suggest, if you have the time, go out, take a tour. I've written an article that kind of tried to give folks a tour through the newspaper, through online. Did the best I could with that, but you'll benefit more by going out and seeing it yourself, and you can make your own determinations about whether they have a space shortage problem, a building condition problem, efficiency problems that result from all that. That's really what's driving this, is that they're spread out quite a bit and in some older buildings, and feel like they're operating in a pretty inefficient way as a result. The project hasn't been without some concerns expressed. There have been people that are concerned about the location that the city has chosen. They have a piece of ground that they have an option to purchase that's across from the Hallmark distribution plant or production plant. So right there at the interchange of the West Lawrence interchange, they're paying $2.25 million for that piece of ground. They're going to get 47 acres. As a result, they need about 15 acres or thereabouts for a police headquarters building, and they're going to try to redevelop the rest of it. So that has been a concern. And then more recently, folks are kind of wondering, well, you know, the projects are starting to pile up a little bit. The county anticipates that within the next couple of years, they're going to need to spend a significant amount of money to upgrade the Douglas County Jail and expand it. They haven't yet uttered an amount of money that that's going to take. I've tried to get them to do that, but that very well could be another $30 million or so to expand that jail. So there's a lot of issues with law enforcement right now, a lot of big ticket items, and the voters will get a chance to decide that first issue on November 4th. So the second issue, once we get done with that election, we'll be ready to get ready for another election. The City Commission has elections in April of 2015. We'll have an election, a primary election in February of 2015 if enough people decide to run. 3 folks on the 5-member commission up for re-election. There's Bob Shum, his term will expire, Mike Devers' term will expire, and Terry Reardon's term will expire. We'll see how many of them choose to run for election again. I'm pretty sure Bob Shum's probably going to run again. He's made some indications of that. He's retired from the restaurant business, and I think enjoys the commission quite a bit. The other 2 don't quite know yet. I think it's going to be an active election with some interesting issues to watch. The one that I'm particularly going to watch is the rental registration issue. If you remember that the City Commission here within the last year approved a new program where essentially every apartment in the city will need to be registered and will need to be licensed, and will go through a periodic inspection. So that process is underway. It was not a popular program with many in the landlord community. It was, as we say, hotly debated, and it wasn't popular with some tenants, and it was extremely popular with some neighborhood groups who really noted that